Hi, Talia. How are you?
Hi, Merle. I'm good. How are you?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. How are you all today?
Doing well.
Doing
That's a
well.
good thing.
Thanks for that book suggestion, Merle. It's actually on sale there.
Yeah, they're doing like 10 or 20% off or something
Yep.
during the pandemic to get people to read more, I think.
It's been one of the
what
blessings.
was the suggestion?
What?
What was the suggestion?
Yeah.
The Musar Torah commentary, whatever it's called. I have to go get the book to give you the exact title.
Yeah, Alan.
Moranis. No,
Yeah, I've been
not Alan Moranis.
delving
Yeah.
more into that. Thanks to Rabbi Susan.
Rabbi.
Yes, Miriam. Hi, how are
Can I
you?
take 1 minute before we start just to ask a question? Because it might not be in what you plan to say today. As I'm getting older this year, I don't know why, I'm only in my 94th year, but I got Sukkot a little mixed up. It's a day of 5 days of Halamoed or 4 days.
So that is exactly a wonderful segue to what we're going to talk about today. So it's a little complicated. So as people are joining out,
now last night was not Yantif, but tonight is Yantif.
Correct.
And then tomorrow is Hoshana Rabbah or Shemini Atzeret, and then Simchat Torah.
Yes. So perfect question. I'm going to answer it as an introduction.
One more thing. Is it an 8 or is it an 8 or a 9-day holiday? Then I'll be quiet.
Well, it's 8. The question is not is it 8 or 9. The question is it 7 or 8, but it's 8 for our purposes.
Thank you.
Hi, Miriam. Hi, Harold. Hi, Don.
Hey, Harold. And hey, Susan and Panina, even though I can't see you, and a welcome to everybody who's with us on Facebook or on YouTube or watching us, who knows when, sometime after right now.
Zoom.
And so Shabbat Shalom, it's Friday afternoon, but also Hag Sameach, because we're still in the midst of a festival and a few other things, as Miriam sort of alluded to, as Sukkot is wrapping up for the most part. And so a quick word about the Jewish calendar as it applies to Sukkot and today, tomorrow, and Sunday. And this comes up with other holidays too, most notably Pesach, Passover, right? Because some of us, I think, know that there's at least outside of the land of Israel, maybe a difference of opinion as to whether or not someone keeps 8 days of Passover, 7 days of Passover, and some of the people are eating pasta and pizza this night, and some of us are waiting another night. And the way it works is that in the land of Israel, Sukkot is 7 days, Passover is 7 days. But outside the land of Israel, both of those holidays are an additional day, 8 days. And the reason for that goes back, to ancient times when the way that word would spread that a holiday had begun was that, they'd go to the top of the hill, they'd light a special fire, and then the next village over, they would see that the fire had been lit. They would light it. It's kind of this like game of telephone.
Brush your teeth, honey.
Right, this sort of game of telephone, and the thinking was that since it would take potentially a significant amount of time once you got beyond, kind of the epicenter for word to spread of the holiday beginning, that for good measure that outside the land of Israel, we're going to observe an extra day, thinking that we may have actually started a day late, right? Because it took the better part of a day for word to reach us. And so, like many things, to this day, the custom outside in diaspora, outside the land of Israel, is that holidays are an extra day. Just a point of information, that is not why there's a second day of Rosh Hashanah. That happens everywhere. The Reform movement, as with many things, kind of in looking, I think, to both embrace modernity and sort of streamline things in liturgy and many different things, said, well, that's in a way ridiculous because we have clocks and we know, we have clocks and calendars and we know when things begin. So we see absolutely no reason to observe an additional day of these festivals when the stipulation in the Torah is in 7 days. And then to add an extra gloss to it and it's in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel, that we're going to observe it, in LA, the same way that it's observed in Israel, so that we're on the same page as them. I have my own opinions about this. And that does put us in solidarity with Jews in Israel, but it takes us out of solidarity with Jews everywhere else in the world, which is sort of that balance, I think. So we are unique. There are probably others, but that I know of, at least in LA. We're unique at the temple in that we are one of the few Reform synagogues that keeps what we call the traditional Jewish calendar. So we keep 8 days of Sukkot and 8 days of Pesach. We follow the same calendar that other communities in diaspora do, not what the Reform movement does. And just for those who are geeking out like Merle with what I'm about to say, that long predates our leaving the Reform movement. That was, I think, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Rabbi Fields who felt like we should be on the same page as the rest of the Jewish world,
right?
Outside of Israel, not just kind of, there's an expression, I think it's a rabbinic expression, that everyone's making Shabbos for themselves, which is sort of like everybody's doing whatever they want,
right?
And that to be on the same, it's. If you drive through Pico Robertson on tomorrow night after Shabbat, like that's when Simchat Torah happens, not tonight. More on that in a second. So if we're in this land of Sukkot being 8 days, the way it in the traditional Jewish world outside of Israel is, then today, last night and today, is a holiday that plenty of Jews, I should actually say a pseudo holiday, that plenty of Jews have never heard of. Which is, so it is today, there's two things. It is the 7th day of Sukkot, and it is again, pseudo holiday. We'll get more to that in a minute, called Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah. It is still counted amongst, and this gets to your question, Miriam, about when Chag starts, but it's still counted amongst these intermediary days of Sukkot. And just the name Hoshana Rabbah means the great. Rabbah is great. Hoshana, which is a series of liturgical poems, usually psalms, that call upon God and ask God to rescue and redeem the Jewish people by sending us rain. Let me just silence this. Excuse me.
Did he say rain?
Yep.
Yes, I said rain.
Thank
yes. You. More on that in a second, as interestingly timely, that's where we're going to end up today, just to let you know where we're going, right? That rain is seen as, particularly this time of year, when we think about Sukkot being a harvest, it being a source of kind of redemption, a symbol of God's redemption for the people. The rabbis, interestingly, view Hoshana Rabbah as almost a miniature Yom Kippur. And we're going to get more into this when we look at some texts in a minute. This is just kind of an overview here. Because Hoshana Rabbah is seen by the rabbis as a judgment day, another day of judgment as to whether or not we are, the Jewish people, are worthy of, fall seasonal rain, right? Israel has a similar climate to here, but this is the time of year in Israel when hopefully it starts to rain, and here as well. Now, these 7 Hoshanot, these 7 prayers, are recited while 7 hakafot, processions, are happening. And a hakafah, think about it just like we do on a Shabbat or High Holy Days, right? Where we take the Torah and we make a lap around the room. So on Hoshana Rabbah, traditionally today, Jews in traditional synagogues this morning are doing 7 hakafot with the Torah, reciting these 7 kind of petitionary prayers. And at the conclusion of those 7 hakafot, there is I could say it's a special ritual. It's also a little bit of a bizarre ritual that takes place, which is that willow branches, just like the willow in the lulav, the willow branches are taken out of the lulav, and they are actually beaten upon the ground. And you're supposed to beat them on the ground until the leaves fall off of them. And this is an idea, there's 2 sort of different pieces to it. I'm going to share one now and the other I'm going to save for the end. is that it's a symbolic attempt, just like Tashlich, to sort of get rid of any remaining sins, right? Again, thinking of Hoshana Rabbah as another mini Yom Kippur, and we're going to, again, say more about that in a second. Last night, the night before Hoshana Rabbah, it's customary in some communities to stay up late, just like on Shavuot, to study Torah, either the entire Torah or the book of Deuteronomy, because that's what we're finishing and going to commemorate in 2 days on Simchat Torah. And tomorrow night, or tomorrow, I should say, is also sort of a pseudo, holiday, I guess, called Shemini Atzeret, which in Israel, and again in Reform, based on the Reform calendar, is almost non-existent, because it gets, since there is no 8th day, it gets just wrapped into Simchat Torah and celebrated simultaneously and pretty much neglected with Simchat Torah. And there's a lot of, there's an old joke that if you want to confuse a Reform Jew, ask them what Shemini Atzeret is. And if you want to confuse an Orthodox Jew, ask them what Shemini Atzeret is, because there's this like ambiguity sort of what it is. I mean, Shemini literally means 8, and it is the 8th day of Sukkot, if that's observed. Atzeret means stop. And there are all sorts of different kind of beautiful readings about it. One of the ones that I particularly like is this idea that it's sort of almost a lingering and not wanting to let go of Sukkot. That there are some that teach that after Hoshana Rabbah you're done, you don't shake the lulav anymore for sure, but that you don't eat in your sukkah anymore. But there are some that say, well, you don't eat in it, but you still sit in it for another day, kind of savoring a little bit of that, right? And kind of just not wanting to totally and completely let go. So that is sort of the landscape of where we are in this place of today of Hoshana Rabbah. So, and that was kind of the overview. So we're going to go a little bit deeper. I brought a few texts. I'm going to share my screen if I can master the technology to do so. Here we go. Okay, and hopefully, let's do this. Hopefully everybody can see. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. Okay. That's a lot of Hebrew. We're going to do the English. That'll make it a little bit more accessible. Okay. Sefer Hasidim. So we're beginning with what I would say is the, well, I should say a superstition that surrounds Hoshana Rabbah for the rabbis. And I'm sharing it more than anything just because I think it's interesting, and it's a little bit of what I would say a Jewish ghost story. So as the story goes, the rabbis imagine that there's a night when the souls come out of their graves on the eve of Hoshana Rabbah, when they come out, and the souls come out of their graves and they pray. And 2 people already went and hid themselves in this graveyard and heard that one was calling to her friend, "Let us go and pray together." All of the souls came out and prayed and asked for mercy so that death would not be decreed upon the living. And those who will die, that they return from their evil ways, and that they die through minor illness. And about every matter of the living and the dead, and about themselves, to quickly remove judgment from upon them and from upon others. And they told their congregation, right? So I'm gonna pause for a second. This, I do think, fits into this idea that it's a mini Yom Kippur, right? That there's this sense of judgment on Hoshana Rabbah, which we're gonna see in the next text, right? But that sense of judgment. So in this kind of superstition that, souls return to sort of pray on behalf of the living. The next year on the eve of Hoshana Rabbah, 2 others went out, and only one virgin did not come out of the grave, who had died last week. They said, "Come out." She said, "I cannot, because my father was rich and lost his possessions and buried me without clothing." And they heard that some of the souls said, "We will not gather together because 2 have already revealed us to many. Rather, each one of us will pray in the grave so that the living will not hear and tell the nation." And they became angry at the father and took clothing and clothed that virgin. And when a shroud decays, does not hold back the soul. For behold, despite the body's decay, the soul rests in the bones, although it departs from the dead body, as is known, that sorcerers who raise a spirit bring it by means of dust that absorbed from the head. It happened that one man didn't see his head's shadow on Hoshana Rabbah night. We're going to focus on that idea a little bit later, this idea of seeing your head shadow on Hoshana Rabbah night. But the idea being, just to give a little background, that is a bad premonition, a bad omen, as it were, if you don't see your shadow on Hoshana Rabbah. And so his loved ones fasted numerous fasts, and they gave a lot of tzedakah. And the man lived for many years after that. As is said, tzedakah saves from death. And I'm going to use the Hebrew for a second. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet. Many of you know Rabbi Leader collects tzedakah boxes. His office at the Glazer campus is littered with them. And he has often said that the reason he likes to collect them is to see the phrases and what different communities over the centuries have put on those boxes in order to, compel or inspire folks to donate. This is the most common phrase. Those 3 words in Hebrew. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet. That tzedakah averts death, right? The idea that giving can actually change, one's fortune. So again, kind of a little bit of a bizarre text, right? When we think about souls in graveyards at night and seeing one shadow. I mean, it's a little, we're not the people that go for Halloween, but it's a little Halloween-y, certainly, to say the least. But I think it highlights this idea that there's this judgment idea that goes with Hoshana Rabbah, that people imagine is really a part of it, in the same way that we're finishing this season, in which really since Rosh Hashanah we've been we're meant to feel, at least even if in a metaphorical sense, that we are being judged by our actions, and that this speaks to that, I think, and to our fate in the year. Taking that one step further, same text here, a little bit later. On the night of Hoshana Rabbah, judgment is sealed, and it is therefore referred to as the end of the year. And on Shemini Atzeret, tomorrow, judgment for the rains of the year is sealed, about how much a person's fields would produce. And this is why after the blessing of healing is the blessing for the year, which contains within it prayer for financial sustenance, as the Psalm says, to save their souls from death and to sustain them from famine. So I'm going to focus on the first part of this for a second, right? That on Hoshana Rabbah, judgment is sealed. So everyone think back with me, 8 days, 9 days, right? 11 days to Yom Kippur, right? And this metaphor of the gates and the book of life. And most of the prayer book and the Machzor talk about, the book of life at the end of Ne'ilah, the gates are closing, right? And what the rabbis actually teach is that, well, the decree may be sealed or written on Yom Kippur, but that it's actually not over yet, that we actually still have more time to change it, right? That even if at the end of Yom Kippur, we're, I don't know if anyone's theology works this way, if we're destined for a certain kind of year, or that we haven't repented yet, that we haven't really done the work yet, we have really until Hoshana Rabbah to do it, because this is really like the last possible, window, right? The last opportunity, last call, I guess is the best way to say it. And that tomorrow there's this judgment for the rains, and that's when that is sealed. And again, remember, think about our ancestors and agrarian people. If the rains don't come at the right time and the harvest is no good and the crops are no good, it's obviously famine for your own family, but it's also for the people and also your livelihood. Right. And this then takes us to Merle, go ahead.
Okay. So my curiosity is I know, when do we do Yizkor, tomorrow or Sunday?
Great question. Tomorrow.
Okay. So is tonight served, because it's supposed to be like a mini Yom Kippur, is tonight or tomorrow, aside from Yizkor tomorrow, any different than regular Shabbat services?
No.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say that. Hallel would be recited.
Well, that's
because
tomorrow. Okay.
Right, tomorrow.
But
Tonight,
that's part of the holiday already. It's not the Yom Kippur.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. I was just
And
curious.
we're going to get to a text later that talks about how it's not from a Jewish law standpoint that it's like a mini Yom Kippur. It's almost metaphorical in the minds of the rabbis.
Okay. Got it.
So here now from Mishnah, right? It says that at 4 times, there's actually 4 different times the world is judged. On Pesach for the crops, on Shavuot for the fruits of the tree, on Rosh Hashanah, for everything, and on Sukkot for water, right? Because this whole thing gets wrapped up. Sukkot, Simchat Torah, Shemini Atzeret, all gets wrapped into one for the rabbis, right? Which sets the scene about water. Okay, so what do we do on Hoshana Rabbah? What does it actually look like? So I mentioned before this kind of, imagine if you were like an anthropologist or sociologist and you walked into a synagogue this morning and you saw a bunch of, I said this last week for the beginning of Sukkot and building a sukkah, but the most highly educated, affluent minority population in the country taking branches of willows and beating them on the ground until the leaves fall off like they're, crazy people, right? So here we learn a little bit about this, how it is meant to be performed at least, which is that in a place called Motza, kind of down from Jerusalem, they went and they gathered large amounts of these willow branches, and they came and they stood up at the sides of the altar in the temple with the tops of the willow branches bent over the altar. They stood them up there. And then they sounded the shofar, tekiah, a teruah, the staccato blast, and then another tekiah. And every day, presumably throughout the festival, they went around the altar saying, Ana Adonai Hoshiana, Ana Adonai Hatzlichana. Right? God save us, God make us prosper. Which is still what is said today, and is part of said when beating these branches. And that on the 7th day, today, Hoshana Rabbah, that they go around the altar 7 times, and that is those 7 hakafot, right? And this text doesn't say it right, and then the custom is after that hakafat to beat these willows. So why 7 times? Why these hakafot? Like what reason can this possibly have? What meaning can this possibly hold, right? So the Shulchan Aruch, which is a late medieval, I'd say, legal code, says that the custom is actually to take out the Torah under the bima, just like a Torah hakafah, right? 1 time each day. And on the 7th day, you do it 7 times, which is what the Mishnah was suggesting. Rama, one of the sages of the time, says actually that some people take out 7 Torahs on the 7th day. And in some places, they have more than 7 Torahs. They would take out all of the Torahs on the 7th day. It is this big kind of festive processional. That's all lovely. That's the how. That does not answer why 7, right? Here's kind of an interesting take on why 7, I think. If they circle the bima 7 times, some say like the 7 levels of the firmament. 7, of course, has a tradition and lots of meaning in our tradition, right? We have the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings that we recite under the chuppah for a bride and a groom. 7 days of creation, which is why 7 or 6 days of creation, but 7 days, in total in the story, counting Shabbat, which is often why 7 is what is attributed to the meaning of 7 as an important number. But here's kind of, I think, an interesting one. There are those who say that the 7 times correspond to the 7 circles around Jericho. The 7 circles around Jericho. What does that mean? Okay, so if we look at the book of Joshua, back to, right, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, in that great, I guess it's a folk song, right? That now Jericho was shut up tight because the Israelites, no one could leave or enter. God said to Joshua, "See, I will deliver Jericho and her king and her warriors into your hands. Let all your troops march around the city and complete 1 circuit of the city. Do this 6 days with 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns preceding the ark. On the seventh day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the horns. And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, as soon as you hear that sound of the horn, all the people shall give a mighty shout. Thereupon the city wall will collapse, and the people shall advance, every man straight ahead. Right, so here's this attempt to draw and make analogous, right, these 7 hakafot that we do with these willows and Torahs and all of this on Hoshana Rabbah with the walls falling down in Jericho. By the way, we're not going to talk about Simchat Torah today, but Simchat Torah, you also do how many hakafot? 7. 7.
7.
7. Okay. Last piece, at least of this section. So commentary on the book of Leviticus. The Rabbi Avin says that the situation on Sukkot can be allegorized to 2 parties who come before a judge, and they do not yet know who has won. The one who exits holding their weapon, we know to be the victor. And at the conclusion of Rosh Hashanah, we do not know, this is again making this about, this is really the end of the High Holy Days. It doesn't really end on Yom Kippur. But at the conclusion of Rosh Hashanah, we do not know how God has judged our case. But when we emerge, when the people of Israel emerge with their lulavim and their etrogim in their hands, we know that Israel has emerged victorious. Right. Okay, so before we get, I'm going to pause this for a second so everybody, if I can do this right. Yeah, hang on, I can see everybody. Okay, let's do this. So let's pause there for a second. What do we make of this? Thoughts, reactions, comments? See, everyone thought that it ended on Yom Kippur, but it doesn't really tell you.
I just have a question about the spirits or the souls coming up from the grave.
Yeah, of course.
You know, in some cultures and religions, there are stories that are on purpose to instill fear in, of course, the children, so that they'll be more inclined to have faith and believe. Is there any of that in this? Do you think?
I don't think so. We certainly have those stories, like, any tradition or any culture. I don't think that's what's here. I think this kind of veers into, I feel like anyway, a whole category of kind of rabbinic literature, rabbinic thought, Jewish thought, that most of us don't actually think about as even being Jewish, right? We are absolutely not going to have the Jews believe in an afterlife conversation today, because that's a whole other 12-hour conversation. And we have, not even a half hour left, but, people, just make it simple, right? People think Jews don't believe in reincarnation. Well, actually we do, not in the same way that the Eastern religions do, but absolutely. There's a reason that all the graves on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem are, everyone's buried facing the old city with their feet pointed that way, so that, when Messiah comes and they rise from the dead, they know which way to walk, is the reason that's given for that, right? So I think this is a whole thought of sort of mystical, small m, not necessarily in the sense of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, but sort of mystical, supernatural thought that the rabbis spend a lot of time talking about in many, many texts, that is just not what we spend very much time talking about or thinking about, but it's certainly there. Rabbi Nickerson was talking the other day about wanting to do a whole session just on Jewish ghost stories. I mean, there's no shortage of them, right? And then if you do venture into Jewish mysticism and into the Zohar and into Kabbalah, there's even more. And these ideas of the golem and all sorts of kind of spooky, kind of scary things. We're going to touch back on that in a few minutes, just with this idea of the head and the shadow and kind of premonitions. Myrtle, I saw your hand too.
Yeah, so back to the soul thing. I mean, the souls coming out of the graves, is that a part of the belief of reincarnation?
That's a good question. I mean, the truthful answer is I don't know.
This
But
is the
my
first time
sense-
I've ever heard of this. So
Yeah, my sense is probably not, because, if you take the text at its surface, it's supposing that they return, right? It's just that night they make a little appearance, and then it's back to bed. Whereas reincarnation would imagine something, markedly different, I think. Right. Okay.
Wow.
Let's press on a little bit. Get my screen back up here. Okay. So, how long has this whole thing with the willows and beating and praying for rain? Because the consensus is that this is really, it's about our judgment, but as pertains to rain and the season. So how long has this been? Is this from Sinai and Moses, or is this something that the rabbis made up, a few centuries ago? Right. So here we go. There are those who say that you should not hold the willow with the 4 species, with the rest of the lulav and etrog and everything, when you are benching lulav, reciting the prayer over the lulav, until after the blessing and the waving. And that if you don't follow this, that you're violating a commandment against adding a mitzvah that wasn't prescribed, right? And so what you're supposed to do is that after you shake the lulav, because today is really the last day you would do that, after you shake the lulav and the etrog, that you basically take the willow out, you hold the willow by itself to demonstrate that that's also an obligation, and then you hold it by itself and you whack it until the leaves come off. Which I will just share as an aside. I did with my 4-year-old daughter this morning. I haven't done it in many years, but we had a lulav, and I knew I was teaching this today, and I thought, why not? You've never seen a little kid have more fun running around the patio than whacking this, willow branch on the ground, right? Now, Rama, again, the sage, says that the common custom is to hold the willow with the 4 species while waving them, but it's better to hold them separately while you do it today, so that it's not conflated, and that during these requests for rain, they should be shaken, right? That's also the idea. When you shake the lulav, it's this idea that it makes the sound of rain. That's the whole piece of the lulav. And that after you do that, you beat it. Now, the Talmud has a kind of disagreement here, right? Again, as to how long ago did this come from, right? And Tractate Sukkah says that it was stated that there was a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, that one of them says that the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ordinance of the prophets, meaning that it would be relatively, for the Jewish context, new, right? The Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi instituted it in the temple as an obligation. And one who says that the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ancient custom practiced by the prophets and adopted by others as well. It was not instituted as a binding ordinance, meaning something that you have to do, right? It's not a mitzvah. It's not a commandment. It's not like, dwelling in the sukkah or, any of the other things that are commandments, right? It's just something that the prophets, much, much later kind of added on, but you're not actually obligated to do it. Gemara suggests and concludes that it was Rabbi Yochanan who said that it was a binding ordinance of the prophets. And Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the mitzvah of the willow branch is an ordinance of the prophets. And so the Gemara, the Talmud says, finished, right? It's from the prophets. It's not, it's not a binding, thing. It's not part of the commandments from Sinai. But a little further down the page, because they don't leave it there, Rabbi Zachariah says to Rabbi Abahu, did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that? Did Rabbi Yochanan say in the name of Rabbi Nehunya of the valley of Beit Hortan that the halacha, that the law of the 10 saplings, that the law of the willow branch in the temple, and the law of the water libation on the altar during Sukkot are each a halacha, a law, a commandment transmitted to Moses from Sinai, right? Didn't he say that? Didn't he say that it was a law, right? The Talmud's saying. How then could he attribute the origin of that law of the willow branch to the prophets? They're contradicting themselves. How is that possible? Right? They already said that this was part of it. This was part of the oral Torah, presumably, that Moses got from God at Mount Sinai. This is a law. He's astonished. And after considering the contradiction, he says that indeed Rabbi Yohanan maintains that the mitzvah of the willow branch is a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai, right? This is like classic Talmudic rabbinic rationalization, in my opinion, right? That it says, right? Of course, he means, no. Yohanan knew that it was a halacha, knew that it was a law. He only said that it was of the prophets because over the course of time, during the Babylonian exile, they forgot some of the laws, including this mitzvah of beating the willow branches. And then the prophets reinstituted those laws, right? So that it wasn't actually a creation of the prophets. The prophets were just reinstituting this practice that was actually was a law. And that's what he was meant when he said that it was of the prophets. He wasn't contradicting himself, right? Classic, I think, kind of Talmudic rabbinic rationalization. Still, by the way, they're still not done with this argument, because then the Gemara turns to and relates that Avihu, the father of Rav, said, I was standing before Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, and a certain man brought a willow branch before him to fulfill the mitzvah. He took it and waved it. He waved it and did not recite a blessing. This indicates that he holds that the mitzvah of the willow branch is a custom of the prophets and is therefore performed without a blessing. There wouldn't be a blessing said over it, right, if it's not a commandment, right? Similarly, the Gemara relates that Avihu and Hezekiah, sons and daughters of Rav, brought a willow branch before Rav to fulfill the mitzvah. He waved it, and he did not recite a blessing. This indicates that he too holds that it is a custom of the prophets. So finally, they seem to rest on this idea that this is not something that is a commandment. It's not something that goes back to biblical times. This is something that was a creation, an advent of the prophets, and that they then themselves, we're going to talk more about this at the end, a creation of the prophets that they then themselves performed, as a way to, I would say, fulfill this prescription, right? Everybody going to rush out and get some willow branches this afternoon to beat on the it's fun. Okay, back to this idea that that today is a pseudo holiday, right? A pseudo holiday and kind of a imagined miniature Yom Kippur without all the restrictions and such, right? So this kind of comes from this idea, right, that on the seventh day, Hoshana Rabbah, the custom, again, not a prescription, but the custom is to recite Psalms, which is also the custom on a Yom Tov, right, on a holiday. So again, Rama the sage says that the early rabbis wrote that there's a sign to be found in the shadow of the moon on Hoshana Rabbah. This is back to, right, Talia, what you were saying about the very first piece we looked at about the graveyard. And it said that at the very end, which led us to the idea of tzedakah averting death, was that this man was there and that he didn't see the shadow of his head on the, or his body presumably also, but on the ground, right? So here the rabbis say, right, that there's a sign to be found in the shadow of the moon on Hoshana Rabbah of what will befall you or your family for this year, right? The notion that there's some kind of premonition, some omen on this night standing there, the shadow that will reveal to you. Hence the fact that this guy in that first vignette was so concerned that it was a bad omen, that there was no shadow, that his friends prayed, gave tzedakah, and his death was averted. But there are others that say you shouldn't look for this. You shouldn't do this because it looks like astrology, which again, the rabbis, interestingly, while very into the cycles of the moon, right? We have a lunar calendar. We have Rosh Chodesh every month, right? Big deal. The rabbis are very, very trepidatious, I would say, about, pursuits that seem sort of extra Jewish, right? Outside the bounds of Judaism, and like sorcery. So astrology and this kind of seems like sorcery to them. And so you shouldn't do this because it looks like astrology to them. And they say, which is also, I think, fair, And because most people don't understand how to interpret the signs. So you're going to stand there and you're going to get some sign. You have no idea what it means. So better not even to try, and be proper and not seek signs for the future, which I think is actually, even in a contemporary context, a very Jewish sort of notion, right? Just live your life, do the best you can. Don't be, too worried about where that's going to lead, right? We're not, that's the Jewish notion, right? Be a good, thoughtful, kind, menschy, humane human being, not because it's going to attain some reward, but because it's going to make today, your world, your life, your family, your community better. Right? Don't look out for signs for the future. Again, the text continues. The people also put out a number of lights, much like on Yom Kippur, because on Sukkot we're judged for the water. And so on the final day of the festival, we have this custom of unbinding the 4 species. You take them apart from each other. Again, hakafot 7 times around the bima, extending and expanding our prayers and requests for water, right? So clearly, right, water is the big theme here. Water and rain is the big theme here. Rabbah the sage continues, and those who are precise in their performance of the commandments, they go to the mikvah before the sun rises in the morning, this morning, just like on Erev Yom Kippur is the custom for many. And there are those who wear a kittel, just like on Yom Kippur. For those who aren't familiar, just a kittel is a white, kind of looks like a cross between a lab coat and a bathrobe, I guess, that traditionally Jewish men wear on 3 occasions, I guess 4 if you count Hoshana Rabbah, under the chuppah at a wedding, at their wedding, every year on Yom Kippur, presumably maybe in some communities now on Hoshana Rabbah, and it is traditionally what one is buried in, which actually leads to why it's worn on Yom Kippur. Worn on Yom Kippur, right? One, because it's white and it's a nice sport to wear white on Yom Kippur, but also in the imagery and the metaphor that Yom Kippur is a rehearsal, as it were, for one's death and a preparation in a way for one's death. That's also a reason to wear the kittel on Yom Kippur. But here to the point here, right? Kittel worn on Hoshana Rabbah in some communities, again, kind of linking it perhaps to Yom Kippur and to this idea. Okay, we're going to pause there for a second. And
Rabbi,
chat about
excuse
this.
me.
Yes, Miriam.
Don't we also wear a white kittel? Those that are conducting the Seder?
Sorry, say that one more time. You broke up a little
Those
bit.
that are conducting the Seder, the men, a man, doesn't he also sit in the white kittel?
Conducting the Passover Seder?
Yes, that's been my experience.
Perhaps. I'm not familiar with that custom, but perhaps.
Oh, okay. The Orthodox Sedarim that I attended, including my own, I grew up in an Orthodox household. My father, Alav Hashalom, always wore a white.
You wore kittel on Pesach as well?
Yes, and so did other ones. So did that I attended other Orthodox Sedarim, and the men wore a white kittel.
So I'm good. So I have not. Thank you for bringing up. I have not seen that, but I'm going to actually use one of the texts that we looked at earlier as a means potentially to explain it, and then I'm going to do some homework later today on this because I'm very curious. Right, but we had this Mishnah text earlier. I'm going to read it just because I don't have it on the screen anymore. That at 4 times the world is.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. That the world is judged on Pesach for the crops, right? On Shavuot for the fruits of the tree, on Rosh Hashanah, and on Sukkot for the water. So I could imagine that if we view Pesach also in a way as a judgment day for the crops, that potentially it could make sense to wear kittel again in the same kind of framework of judgment, right? But that's I'm going to do a little digging on that because I really appreciate you bringing it up, Miriam. Roy, you look like you're threatening to say something.
I'm just curious if you see any of the congregants wearing the kittel on Yom Kippur.
Great question. So were you in a congregation more traditional than ours? You would absolutely see, many. I have, absolutely. I not in mass, but I've definitely seen, not this year, obviously, but I've definitely seen a few folks here and there over the years wearing kittel on Yom Kippur. And it is also just incidentally, sort of in a way, how clergy, we end up wearing these white robes on Yom Kippur, right? And it comes from, the robe comes from a borrowing of Protestant tradition, the same reason we used to wear black robes on Shabbat. White, for all the reasons that white is worn on Yom Kippur, but as sort of I think also certainly in a Reform and conservative too context, for the most part, a more polished looking look. I think I've told this story a few times, and I'm not sure to which audience, but I will never forget when I was, I think in high school, we got a new rabbi at the synagogue I grew up at, my family's synagogue, and he came from a slightly more traditional background, and he had never worn a white robe like we wear on High Holy Days, because that's not normal. He bought one on Rosh Hashanah. He wore his new white robe, but on Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, we're sitting in our seats, and the rabbi walks out of the bima, and he's wearing a kittel, not the robe that he wore on Rosh Hashanah. And I at that point was kind of like knew enough to kind of know what it was, but my mother was sitting next to me. My mother turns to me, she elbows me, she says, "Why is he wearing his bathrobe?" Right? Because it's like if you haven't seen it, it's kind of depending on what it looks like, it's an interesting look. But it's a long answer to your question, right? I mean, there's certainly no reason not to.
Are we seeing a sort of reclamation of these traditions within the congregation?
I mean, yeah, maybe not those traditions. I mean, in the large arc, and Merle can speak to this a little bit too. Absolutely, the apocryphal stories that I can share that predate me, but that I know from being a student of history and a student of the history of the temple and the congregation. And this is true across the board in the Reform movement, right? What we today refer to as classical Reform Judaism, this idea that, particularly in the first half and middle part of the 20th century, of Reform Jews really fearing questions about dual loyalties and really wanting to be seen as full-fledged Americans. We're just Jewish. We go to our Jewish church, you go to your Christian church, but we're the same. And that's where sort of the abandonment of many of these things fell away, particularly what we would call ritual garb, right? Kippah, a talit, kittel, absolutely, tefillin, all these things. And so as the story goes, and not the story, I've heard it from so many people, Rabbi Magnin would literally kick people out of the sanctuary if they were wearing a kippah, much less a talit. Like, get out of here. Like, we don't do that. We are far more, educated and erudite and intellectual for that, poo-poo stuff, right? I wrote a paper on Rabbi Magnin and poured through an oral history interview that he gave, and there's many pearls of wisdom, but one was, you don't see me running around town with a beanie on my head. What would I want to do that for, right? So it just, but that was the world, right? And we said, yeah, Merle.
Oh, I remember right after I was finished being temple president in our congregation here, I had been given a tallis by our two rabbis here. And I think the next week or something, I was in LA and I came to services with my mother and I wore my tallis, and some man, and not very many people were in that big sanctuary on Saturday mornings. And some man, who I have no clue who he was, walks up to me and says, "We don't wear that here." And this was way post Rabbi Magnin. I mean, I think Rabbi Fields was already there. And
yeah,
I said, well, I do. And he walked away shaking his head like I was some kind of a freak.
So we, and today, right, just to go full arc, right? Today, like, I can't tell you that, every person in the congregation wears a talit. Absolutely not. But, no one's going to think twice if someone's sitting in the sanctuary wearing a talit, right? Yeah. And or much less a kippah. Rabbi Leader will tell you that he vividly remembers, the clergy. When I started, we still wore black robes on Saturday morning, for when I was an intern for a very short amount of time. But in the old days, if you look at all the pictures around the building, Rabbi Magnin and others, they wore black robe and they wore an academic hood, red academic hood, reds for divinity, academic hood. No talit, no kippah, no nothing. So Rabbi Leader will tell you that he remembers, I think probably his second, something like that, High Holy Days, that Rabbi Fields went to the Board of Trustees and asked for permission for the clergy to be allowed to wear talitot on the bima while conducting services. and that he remembers walking out onto the Bima Erev Rosh Hashanah wearing a talit, and people in the room gasped. Now, obviously, we've come a long way, right? That is, for many ways no longer the case. So the long answer, again, to your short question, Roy, is that yes, I think that there is absolutely a reclaiming of many of these rituals that were abandoned by the Reform movement, right? You can find plenty of Reform Jews today that keep some version of kashrut. You can find plenty of Reform Jews today, believe it or not, who lay tefillin, right? People think, I had a teacher in rabbinical school, Richard Levy of blessed memory, who used to say that the Reform movement did not get rid of tefillin. The Reform movement got rid of weekday prayer, which is when you wear tefillin. You don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. The Reform movement just got rid of the opportunities at which it would be appropriate for anyone to wear tefillin. If you actually find yourself, as Merle can tell you, in a context of Reform Jews who are gathered for a weekday morning service, you'll actually see some, right, wearing tefillin, because those who are going to show up for a weekday morning service are observant enough that they might, might do that. Talia, I saw your hand. And then
yes, Merle, yay, good for you. I'm so glad that you spoke out for yourself, because honestly, when we first joined Wilshire Boulevard Temple, so my daughter's in 9th grade now. She was in 3rd grade when she said, I want to be bat mitzvah. And I was like, okay. And I found Wilshire Boulevard. We knew some families here, and I would show up Friday night services sometimes in jeans, because I'd be running around single momming it, driving her to dance and this. And then we would just want to come to services and be a part of, not near her bat mitzvah, but when she was little. And I remember someone said to me, oh, you're wearing no jeans. I was like, oh my God, like mortified. I was embarrassed. But then now at high holidays, I see women, even when their daughter's being bat mitzvahed, wearing a skinny tank top thing without their shoulders covered. And then I see women wearing that to, Rosh Hashanah services. And I'm grateful that there's flexibility and allowing people to be Jews in the way that they feel comfortable at our temple. I am so glad you spoke up, because I didn't speak up. I got scared and felt ashamed and thought I can't come to services again unless I have the time to prepare.
I grew up at Wilshire and have been through all these phases that Rabbi has just spoken about. And I remember, my cousin, who was probably about 5 years younger than me, she was the first female to have a bat mitzvah, and there was a lot of money there, but she told Rabbi Magdan, this is what I'm doing, and there wasn't an option, but she was laughed at by the congregation. But I also feel today, looking back, that he really needed that money, for whatever. But there have been huge changes, and it's interesting, because I find that Wilshire now is way more traditional than the congregation that I belong to here in Phoenix, that I thought was very traditional. But especially over the last few months with high holidays and the way that things have been explained prayer-wise and everything, I'm finding Wilshire more traditional than it ever was. And that keeps, and I'm still involved as much as I can be, mostly during the summer, but things keep progressing towards a different traditional level. And I kind of learned when I was working for URJ and working for my temple here, I just suddenly found my voice and I speak up, because there was a time when I would have shriveled down in my chair in that sanctuary and not said a word. But I woke up one day. What can I say?
We're all thankful for that, Merle. And Talia, just to your point about the Friday nights, because I think about this often, actually. I also bemoan the people who come to high holiday services, in my opinion, inappropriately dressed. But when it comes to Friday nights, and just a second, Miriam, when it comes to Friday nights, Roy knows my sartorial appreciations well, and we share them. I grew up, not that long ago, at a synagogue in Santa Barbara, pretty casual place. My father and I would never in a million years have showed up to temple on a Friday night without wearing a coat and tie. Never. Right? And that being said, I think today, Talia, and you've been around recently, in non-COVID times, I think people do feel pretty comfortable coming to temple on a Friday night in jeans, or or certainly not in a coat and tie, and I think that's a good thing. I think that people should feel like they can just swing by on a Friday night at 6 o'clock, however they were dressed for the day. It's hard enough to get there at 6 o'clock with traffic and everything else. Like, we don't need to make it harder for people. It doesn't show us any disrespect. Yom Kippur is one thing. A Friday night, so I think that's a good thing. And Merle, to your point, I think that all of it's a moving target and it evolves. And it's you say traditional. Yes, we're traditional in certain aspects of the liturgy, and then I get phone calls. What's wrong with you people? You're blowing shofar on Shabbat. Or what's wrong with you people? You're shaking the lulav on Shabbat. Neither of which you're supposed to do traditionally. The prohibition, in both cases, by the way, is not against shaking the lulav, nor against blowing the shofar. It's against carrying them. But that's beside the point. Miriam.
Yes, I wanted to say that I view all this with such a good, positive feeling. On Pico Boulevard, Rabbi Kanevsky, who was the rabbi of the B'nai David congregation, Pico at Robertson, he has a full-time woman rabbi. And this is an Orthodox shul that is has a mechitza. It's divided, women and the men. Yet the women are carrying the Torah, carrying it on the woman's side. Brilliant. He has made such strides that are also. I think people want to do more today, not less. They would like to do more. Women might want to put on a talit on a Shabbat morning just because they might own one. They got one as a gift. And I remember the first time I ever wore a talit, my husband took this beautiful talit that I bought in Israel for him some 40 years ago, and he put it on my shoulders. I was called up for an aliyah the first time in my entire life in a conservative synagogue, Temple Beth Am. They called me up. I was surprised. And I have to admit that the talit on my shoulders was something I could not explain. It felt so wonderful. I felt enveloped. I felt wrapped. And going up to the Torah for the first time in my life, I felt was a milestone in my life. I'll just end with this one sentence. I feel every woman should have that experience in her lifetime.
Beautiful, Miriam. Thank you. Susan, I'll give you the last one, and then we got to wrap up. Go ahead.
Yes, Miriam, I like that, but I like the return to Talit. I've been at Wilshire Boulevard for a long time, and actually we belonged to two temples because I didn't care for the lack of respect for some ritual, and that when it was in earlier times. And we've joined. We were full time at both temples. I liked it when Harvey Field started bringing back some tradition. And I hear you for the Talit. There's something about putting on something that takes you in another place. And by the same token, Talia, I get upset for women who come with the spaghetti straps and legs showing and their skirts up to their pulpit, because it shows a disrespect for the environment in which you're in, and it's seductive. And when I see women like that, I think there's a reason that the Orthodox separate the men from the women. And my criticism is really just for women. Fine wearing the spaghetti straps and skirts up to their private parts in public, but when you come to a temple, there's an element of decorum. So my husband wears jeans on Friday night too, so I'm not discounting your story in the jeans. I am discounting women's obliviousness and naivete in wearing, I think, inappropriate clothes in a temple and in a service.
I could talk about the temple and for hours on end. I do want to steer us back just as a means of wrapping up to Hoshana Rabbah and to one final text that I think kind of hopefully puts a little bit of a bow around this and leaves us maybe with something that is particularly poignant and relevant given what we're facing these days. So this last text is kind of a more contemporary commentary. I'm going to skip the first paragraph. It says that there are numerous examples of prophets performing actions that represent the content of their prophecy, right? Prophets who are actually doing what they prophesized will happen. And Nachmanides, the famous commentator, explains that such actions serve to ratify those prophecies and make them absolutely certain to be fulfilled, right? So if the prophet does what the prophet says was going to happen, the prophet immediately becomes right? Think of the sound of a synagogue full of aravot, that's the willow branches, being beat against the floor. The sound is almost identical to the sound of a hard rainfall. The aravot, the willows of the brook, which require abundant water, hitting the ground like rain and making the sound of rain. We perform this representative action and we say, Kol mevaser. The sound heralds, the sound makes it happen. Right? After many paragraphs of pleading with God to save us, Hoshana, we take our prayers to another level. Just as a prophet ratifies and secures the positive outcome of his prophecy through representative action, we make our prayers more likely to be fulfilled by performing an action that represents those prayers. It is no longer merely a request. We have done a representative action. In the words of Nachmanides, the decree must absolutely be fulfilled. To put it in another way, when we beat those willows as aravot on the floor, we behave like prophets. Minhag Nevi'im, the custom of the prophets. Indeed, right? To reference back to this debate as to whether it's from the prophets or it's biblical, right? So that's what I want to leave us with, this idea that we behave like prophets when we do these, when we beat these willows on the floor, right? When we're praying for rain. And I think that sometimes we think of our ancestors as being these primitive people that prayed for rain and prayed for this, and we're going to pray for rain. What are we, hocus pocus? Well, there's how many million acres on fire in California right now? I think a lot of us are praying for rain. And this is the time of year when we do that. And so my hope and my prayer is that that there is maybe some efficacy to us all behaving like prophets on this Hoshana Rabbah, and that the prayers for rain, which by the way get inserted into the Amidah starting next week until Pesach, this whole winter, do bring about a little bit of relief, because we too, just like our ancestors right now, are living, I think, in a place and in a world that could absolutely use a little bit of rain. So thanks everybody for making a little bit of time to learn and study today over your lunch hour. Hag Sameach, Shana Tova. Have a wonderful rest of your Hoshana Rabbah. Enjoy the who knows what Shemini Atzeret really is, and a wonderful, wonderful Simchat Torah. I'll make a quick plug. Sunday evening, Simchat Torah, 5 o'clock. You just got an email a few hours ago. We're all teaching quick little bits of Torah. There's a great movie thing after dinner. It should be a really, really wonderful evening. So take care, everybody. Shabbat.